Whether you're taking part in your student media publication because it's fun, or because it's a practice run at heading up a media empire, editing student media gives you a lot of practical real-world skills. Join Naaman Zhou in conversation with Michael Sun as they discuss how he translated his student media skills into the real world and what he wishes he'd known when working in student media. Naaman Zhou is a reporter for Guardian Australia. He was an editor of Honi Soit, the University of Sydney's student newspaper, in 2016, and was a reporter for the newspaper in 2014 and 2015. He has also worked for a legal publication, Justinian and the Gazette of Law and Journalism, and studied arts law. Michael Sun is a writer, editor, and designer from Sydney who loves beautiful dogs and ugly fonts. He's a previous VoiceWorks designer and has produced design work for Japanese Wallpaper, Liminal Magazine, and Emerging Writers Festival. Currently, he's the culture editor at Netflix ANZ and has published film and arts criticism in The Guardian, The Monthly, Vice, ABC Arts, The Age, and more. Naaman and Michael join us now for Interview with a Vampire, Life After Student Media Death.
Good morning. How's it going, Naaman? Wait, Naaman, I think your mic might be off. Can I hear you now? Yeah, getting some sound now.
Great.
Okay, perfect.
Hello, I'm good. How are you? Thanks for...
I feel extremely flattered by that intro, by the way. Like, I feel like that was a very official intro that kind of made me realize all of my journalistic dreams again. But yeah, let's dive right in.
It's great. It's exciting. Maybe we should go into TV or something.
Exactly. I was gonna say, like, if anyone is hiring in TV, that'll be my show reel right there. But yeah, so obviously, Naaman, as that very impressive bio said, you're currently working at Guardian Australia. But for some context for everyone watching at home right now, me and Naaman both edited our student paper Honi Soit at the University of Sydney. I edited in 2017. Naaman edited in 2016. Is that correct? In 2016. Yeah, Naaman's come a long way since then. I have come away. And basically in this talk, we're going to be chatting a little bit to you about some of the things we learnt during our student media days, some of the things we wish we learnt, and then all of those skills that we then brought into our careers. Please definitely also feel free to ask questions at any time, because especially because me and Naaman can't actually see you guys, it's like a weirdly isolating experience for us. So yeah, please comment and ask questions at any time. We actually have one from Pretty and Pretentious. Wouldn't be a Zoom call without your mic is muted. That is so true. 2021, and we still haven't gotten any better at unmuting mics. So...
we're really keen to take questions, because I think we sort of planned this very roughly to do half of us yapping on, but then we're very keen to have like a whole, you decide when, Michael, but like almost like a full half of questions. So if you put them in, we'll definitely get round to them, and then
Exactly. So Naaman, we also some context as well. We actually went to this conference, both individually in our respective years, which was really exciting. Got to meet a whole bunch of other people from all across Australia. So you've made the right choice by coming here, even if virtually. But Naaman, I want to ask you, like, kind of paint the picture for me, right? Like, how did you actually get into your career post-student media, and what were the kind of first steps you took?
Right. Yes. So as that intro said back when it flashed up, so I started writing for Honi in 2014. So I started uni in 2012. When I got to uni, I didn't really know that much about student media, but I just thought, it was amazing that a tiny little community could have like its own newspaper and its own culture and like its own gossip and its own news. So I read Honi, a little bit when I was in first year. I was really keen to write for it. I never actually thought I would be a journalist. I didn't study media, and many people actually who I edited Oni with, and other people afterwards didn't study media either. But anyway, I started writing for the newspaper in 2014 and 15. I found that I loved it so much. I then ran to be an editor along with 9 other people in 2016. And well, the way that it turned into a job for me is, I think I'm extraordinarily lucky. So basically, after about a full year of editing Oni, we were quite lucky in that we actually did break some news as a team, and we did generate a lot of original stuff. And so then I saw there was an opening. It was a job ad for a job at The Guardian at the end of 2016. And it was for a full-time reporter, and I applied for it. And I didn't get to the job, and I definitely was not qualified for it. But I, wrote up a resume with the stuff that I had done for Oni, some of the examples of the work that we've done as a team. And I got to the first round of interviews. So then I got to, have an interview with the editor, Lionel Taylor, and the news editor and the deputy editor. And I didn't get the job. They told me that in a very kind rejection email, they were like, "Oh, we gave the job to someone who has been working in journalism for like 6 years." And I was like, "Well, why are you apologizing to me? That is completely reasonable." But then afterwards, they sort of said, "Well, if you'd like to do some freelancing, then maybe you could do this." And I think I did maybe like one article over across like 3 or 4 months, just freelancing. And then a part-time position came up, which I think someone else went on paternity leave, and so they were out of the office maybe like 2-3 days a week. So then I would cover for them, and then eventually it turned into a permanent part-time, which was basically a form of cadetship. And from there, so I've been there since I've been there sort of more permanently since 2017, and then I actually was there while I was still studying. So I finished my degree in 2018, I think, and then I went full-time after that. Yeah.
So I think that's kind of like almost the dream path. It's like you leave student media and you pretty much like immediately get a job in the media. But I also kind of like so relate to that sense of just like almost not like overinflated, but I definitely think you get a sense of like bravado from editing your student paper or your student publication, that like you really think you can just like apply immediately for these very high level jobs.
Not just bravado, but it is good. People, you should apply for jobs that you aren't quite qualified for, because it's still good to get interviews and to just sort of shoot for the moon, I guess.
Exactly. Shoot for the stars, and if you miss, you'll land on the moon. Is that what the saying is?
That's true. Yeah. Or shoot for the moon is also good.
I feel like I had kind of a different experience to that, because when I finished my year of editing my publication in like 2017, I keep getting that year wrong, in 2017, I was very much like, oh, I don't know whether I want a full-time job right now, because I was very much still studying and am unfortunately still studying, have not finished my degree, embarrassingly. But I remember in that year afterwards, I think I just tried to freelance as much as possible. And I think one thing that I really want to stress is that because editing your publication gives you like these skills and equips you with a skill set that we'll be talking about later as well, in terms of like recognizing what editors actually want and what actually goes on to become interesting content. I think that really equipped me with the skills to start freelancing and start pitching. So I think I've definitely had like a more circuitous journey to you, Naaman. But definitely using
that's why it's great
to get bylines.
Yeah, well, that's why it's great that we're both here, because I think you have had a slightly different journey, but also like an equally probably more fun one. And that's why like I'm keen to have as much of your sort of like contrary input as possible, because I'm very conscious in this whole discussion that like I really don't want to give one size fits all advice. And a lot of things come down to luck and like the unique context. So it's definitely my story is a very strange one that you shouldn't try and copy.
We might actually take a question from Will, which is kind of related to this. So they said, After you entered post-student media, did you feel like there was a gap between writing for student media and quote-unquote professional media? And if so, what are your suggestions on filling that kind of gap?
That's a great question. So I think there is a gap, and to have a sort of simplistic divide, I think there is a divide though between, say, news and culture, or maybe like news and feature and other kinds of writing. And I think we've actually both done both. So it's actually we can talk to both sides of it. So the first thing to say is that there's less of a gap between, I would say, news and there's less of a gap between student media and professional media and news than you think. So one of the big themes that I was intending to come into this with is that student media, I think we're quite lucky in the past, 5, 8, 10 years. It is treated like real media. So the bylines that you get are treated like real bylines. And, in fact, it's almost, it's very similar to doing community news or doing, regional news, because it is just news of a community. And, there's nothing, if you do good work about, niche university, say university reforms or simple extension reforms, that is still an example of good journalism. So a lot of the time, if you do good work in student media, it can easily become sometimes national news and definitely, city level news. And a good example, I was thinking of this recently today. There was a story in the Sydney Morning Herald, I think, like a week or two ago, because a lot of newspapers are looking at, the return, this is last year and this year, such unprecedented and extreme years for unis. There are a lot of questions about how students go to uni, and the Sydney Morning Herald did a story about how UTS, for example, is stockpiling up on masks because, they will need a lot of masks to facilitate the classes that they plan to bring to campus. And if you look at that, quite honestly, there is no gap between that as a professional media story and a student story. There's no reason that you couldn't break or write a story that's very similar. I think there is a bit more of a gap when it comes to culture and other kinds of writing, only because, I'm keen to get your thoughts on this. I find, even though the subject matter sometimes will be very similar, in order, for example, for a place like The Guardian to publish culture writing, it almost always needs a very clear or strong news hook, whether that is it's a show that has recently come out, or maybe you're contrasting a show that has recently come out with its genre predecessor. So it's still, sort of a historical culture piece, but it has some kind of new peg. I think the standards for what is relevant and the standards for what they will publish are much higher, not necessarily in, quality or anything like that, but just in terms of the kind of specificity of the idea.
I think that idea of relevance is really interesting, because I think that is often the determining factor between what will segregate student media and I guess quote unquote professional media, is that idea that a lot of student media, and this is not at all a fault. In fact, I think this is one of the great parts about student media, is not only about providing things to be read, but it's also providing platforms for students of that university to actually get published for the first time, or get their work edited, or cut their teeth on if they're a new writer, or if they want to try out an idea that's that would not be perhaps accepted somewhere else. So I feel in that sense, whereas a lot of professional media is very and necessarily driven by an audience, as in we obviously for any piece of media that gets published in the wider world, there needs to be a readership for it. There needs to be a reason we're publishing this, simply because of the demands of the media industry in general. Whereas I think student media is that kind of fertile ground for a lot of more experimental and a lot of more emerging work to be published. But having said that, I think in that sense, it's almost not super different from, say, doing an internship, where you can also kind of cut your teeth, gain those skills by going through a learning process. And I think that's a lot of what student media is about, learning and honing your skills and honing your writer's skills to the next level.
Yeah. And as for the last bit on suggestions for filling the gap, so I mean, I think my advice is you learn through reading, or like keep an eye on what the publications that you want to, the professional publications you want to like pitch for, be published in. Keep an eye on what they do. So, for example, that UTS one is literally, I just read it and I was like, well, I could have done that, So do that, and I think another big theme of like what we learned is that you learn how to fill that gap by being an editor / being a reporter, and then it's through that process that you learn what a story is, or at least you learn what different you will learn what different publications want. So I think like we might talk about it later as well, but like you should, if you have a really clear idea of what your magazine or newspaper finds interesting, and then you communicate that to your reporters, or at least you hone that, then when you look at other outlets, you'll be like, oh, I think that they only want to do international culture if it has an Australian angle. And you can pick that up, and then you'll be like, right, well, that has now taught me that if I want to fill that gap, then that's what I need to do. It's important. Yeah, it's important to learn what makes a story and what makes something publishable. And student media is great. It's probably the best ever learning process for determining like what the different ways that, because every outlet has a different yardstick for that, but you get to learn.
And I think it's not only a learning process for yourself as editors, but it definitely is also a learning process for all the writers and illustrators and designers and everyone else who makes up your team, who contributes to the paper. On that note, a great question from Sophie that came through earlier. They asked, do you feel as though student media editors are somewhat more responsible for helping or guiding content writers when compared to other real-world publications?
Yes, and this is the thing. This is a great question, because like a huge caveat that I want to put on all of our discussions is that we both made a ton of like, I don't know, like mistakes, or just like half the stuff I wrote.
Yourself, David.
Yeah. Half the stuff I wrote, I was like, I probably would have done that differently. And we should never ever forget that it's like good to set yourself high standards, and it's like good to like, this whole time me and Mike were going to be like, make the best of, shoot your shot and like make the best of this year. But yeah, at the end of the day, you are a student publication for people who are going to be writing for the first time ever. You're going to be editing or writing for the first time ever. And it is a learning process. So absolutely, editors are more responsible for, like, as you say, teaching your reporters definitely than in professional ones, where, especially if you are a freelancer pitching to them, and, they have limited time, and, editors aren't very highly paid, depending on which, outlet. They are not going to take a very long time to teach you. And as a student editor, you should always keep in mind that, it is your job to teach your reporters, and, you probably benefited from that as well.
Yeah, so I was not Naaman's reporter, but I was a writer in Naaman's team for Oni. And I could definitely remember certain times where, because I was literally like writing for one of the first times ever in this kind of sense, there were definitely times where I made so many mistakes as a writer, or even when like pitching things, I wouldn't know like how to find an angle or find a hook. I think these are definitely things that as an editor, and especially a student media editor, you have a big responsibility to be like guiding and teaching your writers along the way. And I think specifically one of the mistakes, or not mistakes, but one of the like learning areas that we all need to be upskilled on when we're first emerging is this idea of like pitching. I think often like you can read as much as you can or want about like how to pitch, or like different ways to write a pitch, or different ways to find an angle. But I think in practice, it's still going to be really hard for the first couple of times you do it, because you've just never done it before. And I think it's such a specific skill set that is different from a lot of the other things that we do in creative industries or in the media. I think one thing that, this is not a student publication, but one thing that VoiceWorks actually does really well, VoiceWorks is a literary journal published by Express Media, who who are running this conference. Plug. I think one thing that I really like about VoiceWorks is that they actually provide feedback on like each and every submission that goes into the magazine. And that's done by like a core team of like volunteer editors at VoiceWorks. But I think that's a model that I really admire. And then I think we should, I don't know, like be trying to implement more in student media if we do have that kind of time, because that's one of the only ways that people will learn how to get better if their pitches aren't just being roundly rejected, but actually you're giving them specific feedback on how they can improve for next time, even if it's like really quick feedback.
Yeah, and it improves, and like it improves you as well, because until you're forced to decide and then explain to someone, and you know, by the way, you could be wrong. First of all, like you could be, you know, you have to explain to them, look, we don't find this like, because most pitches come to you, they are interesting. Like no pitch is not uninteresting. Then you'll be like, right, well, the reason that we've decided to not do this one, but we did this other one is because, you know, like X, Y, Z. And then that at least teaches you how to, sometimes it'll just make you think about what's interesting or not. And then that'll teach you how to make your writing more interesting, or at least like have an awareness of where it fits. And then, you know, something that I just like, it's very broad advice, but I always try and think of like, you know, why would someone read something that I wrote? Or if I have read something, it's like, why did I click on that link? Why did I click on that headline? You know, and then why did I not click on the other one? And that's just, you know, it's always good to be thinking about that. Yeah.
A question from Pretty and Pretentious. Did you find yourself coming up against a harsh reality that some publications just didn't value the experience of student publications and were looking for something more substantial? Or do you think it was like a bit more fair when you tiptoed out of the student media world?
Well, no, I think there's hopefully, I'm going to speak from my experience, but I think most outlets now won't discount your work just because it's in a student publication, if that makes sense. I don't think there is a stigma to it. I think many people in the industry are completely aware of the fact that opportunities for like cadetships and internships essentially do not exist in the same way that they used to, right? So maybe in a previous generation or two, they'd say, you know, why did you write for the student newspaper instead of, you know, going to a regional area or doing this and that? Actually, there are still many jobs in regional areas, and that's like a huge bit of advice that many journalists will give you, which is still good advice, which is if you want to get a job, you can always move to a regional area. But I don't think there's an automatic, you know, stigma against student media. I think actually also a lot of editors, probably a lot of older journalists actually would have written for their equivalent of a student newspaper, so they probably have fond memories of that. I think the question is your work itself substantial? So I think, like, sorry, it's not the best answer, but I think it is just an objective thing there. If you do really good, substantial, and either like original or, you know, really relevant work, and, you know, that's probably more true for news. Like if you break interesting news, there's no way that someone would discount it because it's from a student newspaper or magazine.
I think very similar in like culture writing, which I guess is where most of my background is in. And I also think that a lot of publications are very willing to accept new writers or writers who have not written for like any mainstream or big publications before. Like I remember when I was first pitching some of my first articles for like Junkie or Vice, like I literally didn't have any bylines apart from the ones in my student publication. But I think that like, because you do have those student publication bylines, you're able to have that portfolio. And I think if you have a really strong pitch combined with like demonstrated interest in this area, or like they can see that you've written something before and are not just like totally green, it definitely, I think it, like in 9 times out of 10, it would always count as a plus. And like I don't think it would ever be discounted as experience.
Absolutely. You can get ABC cadetships entirely off student media and like degree based bylines and video and stuff. And I mean, that's basically like, yeah, that says it all really. Like everyone respects it pretty much.
So I kind of want to move on now to talking about some of the specific skills that we learned during our year. And this is actually a question from Slow Pokin as well. Love that username. They asked, what are some of the student publication skills you gained from school that have really impacted the work you do now, and how?
Right. So yes, I had to think about this. There are two broad skills that I think I learned from editing or being in student media. The first one is essentially like the pressure of it. And when I say that, I don't mean that to be like, again, I don't want it to be all just like breaking news and like covering like the latest protests and stuff like that. I mean, just like the very subtle but real pressure that the thing that you write is going to become real and will be read by like an uncontrollable number of people. And the fact that you'll have to give it to an editor or someone else, to do something with it. And so again, in a professional context, pressure at its most extreme is like literally being on a live blog and sending something in within like a minute or, a story within a day. But, in a student news context, if you say you take, 3 or 4 days to write news or a week to write news, or, and this is also true for me in terms of writing culture, like you will be given like 2 weeks to write it. That still is something that for most people will be the first time they ever do that. And that makes a huge difference, even if you're given 2 weeks to write a piece about like, something that a review of something you already love. The fact that you have to file it within 2 weeks is an like invaluable learning experience. And you have to deal with the editor giving back edits, and you have to think, oh, I'm writing for an audience now, not just myself. And then that we sort of talked about it briefly, so I won't spend too much time on it. But then that other skill it teaches you what a story is. And so this is especially true if you're an editor. You should, and you sort of have to decide what is interesting and what isn't interesting for your publication. And I'd probably encourage you to like have a chat in your groups and like, come up with like rules, or like just, have a discussion as to why you think, why you would institute a certain rule, or why would you, give certain advice. And then that impacts the work that I do now, because it's taught me how to pitch what is and isn't a story. So be not in a mean way, but I try and be critical, maybe at least internally, of your reporters' pitches or like the stuff you put out, and just have a think about why you're putting it out.
Yeah.
Yeah. You, Michael, yeah.
Yeah. I'm totally on board with that as well. And the whole idea where it's like, this is maybe one of the first times in your life that you will actually be getting to make decisions about what you think you and the audience of your paper will want to read. So hopefully you can transfer that on the flip side and think about what other editors of like publications want to read when you send out your own pitches and make your own tracks into the world. I also think just like functionally, like one of the biggest skills I came away with from student media was just like straight up design skills, which I hadn't like had that much experience in. I mean, I'd always had an interest in it. I did some of it in like high school, et cetera, but I never really designed for publication as extensively as I did before. And then I went on from Oni to then design VoiceWorks and designed a whole bunch of other things in just like freelance capacity. So I think that's definitely something if you're interested in, not only design as well, but there are so many elements of student media that you can choose to upskill in over your year as an editor away from writing, whether that's like multimedia stuff, or like maybe you want to try podcasting, which I shouldn't be saying because every man and his dog has a podcast now. But like if you ever wanted to try like other multimedia or other non-writing elements, you can definitely like use that year to actually use that year to actually give yourself the opportunity to try out those things while you have the budget and you have the and you have the reign to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I maybe we'll do it at the end, but I really want to stress that like maybe after finishing my year, I sort of looked back and I was like, oh, there were many opportunities for writers and for like news and culture writers, but there's probably better opportunities for designers and other kinds of and even like comedians and other kinds of work out of student publications that the key is you wouldn't get it elsewhere. You can sort of only get it there. Yeah.
Mm. And so this is really random as well, but I feel like I ended up doing like a really random amount of event organizing during my year in Oni. And this is something that no one will ever tell you, but like you like the amount of events you will have to organize from scratch during your year. Even if that's like not a field you want to go into, that is going to give you some like serious, just accidental / forced organizational skills. Yeah, I know that in your year,
you
Nathan,
just do
as
as
well,
much as
you guys
can.
had so many parties and launches, etc.
Yeah, teaches you how to book a room, definitely. Yeah.
Exactly that. I want to kind of go into the flip side now of that question, which is, do you think student media gave you any incorrect assumptions, or was there anything that leaving student media you had to almost unlearn when you entered like the real world?
Yes. So I think a huge incorrect assumption is this idea that everyone has to go into journalism, or that everyone is guaranteed to go into journalism. So I think as a student editor, I definitely probably had a bit too much hype around the media, and also I think you maybe like lionize, or like idolize people a bit too much. Like, oh my god, this person edited like 2 years before me, and like look at what they're doing and stuff like that. I think that is a huge incorrect assumption. For many reasons, just because the industry is probably like less. Oh, well, the industry is less fun and less and less forgiving than student media. So, sort of like not a regret, but like genuinely, student media is so much more fun than having a job in sort of like professional media. You'll never have as much control and scope, and never be like as close to the action. Again, whether that's news or like design, than in student media. So definitely remember that, and don't treat it like a stepping stone to a bigger job, because it is what you make of it, and you should put everything into it. I guess another incorrect assumption, well, sort of an incorrect assumption it gave me about the real world is, sort of as we were saying, not all pitches will succeed. There is still a very big jump in terms of the relevance of something that you write in student media, and the relevance in real world media. Didn't really affect me, but if you had like an opinion column in your student newspaper, I think you'll find it very hard to find anywhere else that would pick that up without just off the back of that. Even if you have very interesting opinions that are written very well, there's not really very few places publish that sort of thing unless you have some other profile to justify that. And sorry, I'm just looking at my notes. And many like places are still run on a shoestring. So even if you have an idea that is really good, and that would otherwise be a story for a professional outlet. So, for example, I keep talking about this UTS mask story, but like it's quite unlikely that they will commission you to write that, because resource-wise, it doesn't really make sense, because they don't really know who you are. It's relatively hard to like vouch for you, whereas they could also find that information out, but via other means, or just sort of wait and then find and then roll into something later. So yeah. What about your thoughts?
Well, I think that the biggest mistake that I made during my like student media year was honestly like one you've already mentioned, which is just that there are people that you will look up to so much, and then you'll be like, I want to be them, or like they're in the media and they're like a hotshot person who's come from student media, and then it'll feel very much like you're trying to emulate them, and like you want to. It's like I feel like the mistake is that if you treat your student media year as like nothing but a stepping stone, I also think that's like that will not be an enjoyable year for you, because I think like it'll become like very competitive, potentially toxic. It's just not a good mindset to get into, because you won't actually make the most of what it actually is, which is a place for experimentation and fun, and like and to like even to be cheesy, like creating friendships that will last the rest of your life with your with your student media team, because you're literally locked in an office with them for 20 hours a week trying to like edit all the pieces on time. So definitely do not try and just like treat this just as something for you to milk into a real job. If it happens, like that's like the cherry on top. It's a bonus, and it'll happen naturally with your skills and with what you've learnt, even after you leave student media. I do have a question for you now, Naaman, which is kind of on this idea of news. So this is also related to a question from Indio, who asked about this kind of like having a news sense and whether you need to have a different news sense for student media as opposed to professional media. But it also kind of relates to what you were saying about freelancing, I guess, because definitely I feel like in my experience, a lot of culture writing is freelanced out. Like I don't think many publications have like an in-house like culture writers room beyond like an editor or maybe like a deputy editor. But in news,
absolutely,
of course, a lot of publications do have already a newsroom, so it's harder to kind of get that freelancing in. So I guess kind of a double question. Do you think there's like a different news sense involved with professional media, and also how do you actually crack into news media?
Yes, great question. So, all right, I've got a bit of I have a lot of thoughts, but I'll try and get them into like simple and elegant form. So, first of all, news is extremely hard, and you should absolutely feel it should be normal to feel completely overwhelmed by not knowing what news is. So I'm quite lucky in that, again, and I think this is so Oni is a weekly newspaper, which means that a lot of the time and over like many years, it has to be filled with something. So the benefit of that is that in that way, there's like an incentive for you to fill that with news, and then that also like a culture that is conducive to news generates more news. But definitely, like pretty much, let's say maybe like even halfway through my own editorial year, by which point I had been like writing for Oni for 2.5 years, I would look at other reporters and like my fellow editors who were like really good at news, and I just basically go like, I have no idea how they did that. I have no idea how they got that story. Like that obviously is news to me. Like now that you've written it out, but like I have no idea how to get that in the first place. So the first thing is that you look around and see what kinds of student news you think is interesting. And I guess it's sort of easy to learn through examples. So an example of a way to get a student news sense is, well, again, so for example, there are a lot of people wondering what is going to happen to unis this year, and including last year. So as we all know, there's been a huge financial shakeup of a lot of unis' business models. There were a lot of course cuts last year and maybe continuing to this year. So a question you can ask yourself is, well, how do those course cuts like manifest on my campus? So say, for example, there is a course where last year it was slated for a cut, and then this year, you go into class and a friend of yours, or like, there's chatter that degree, they're like, oh, we used to have this fantastic equipment, now we don't have it anymore. Or we used to go on these like field trips, we don't do that anymore. Or like like a long-serving and beloved lecturer like leaves. So that would be great. That is news because it is a real-world concern that ties into like a broader structure. And again, I literally did a story maybe like a few months ago, which was that Macquarie University said that they would cut their gender studies major. And I found out about it, I think it was the Macquarie University Women's Collective just posted that on Facebook. And the reason it was interesting is because they said that major had been around for like 50 years. Like it had been around for so long. And that was, in and of itself, basically national news. I combined it with another course in Melbourne that was also being cut that was around the same age. And that was deemed to be national news. It's an example of like how far these cuts are going. But that Macquarie University alone is definitely like city level news, and it's definitely the Sydney level news. So there, so I lost my train of thought. But other ways to find news. So there's news in just like uni finances. There's also news in uni administration. So I don't know, all unis are different, but if your uni has meetings where they're like relatively open, and the vice chancellor or whatever will talk about like how they're going to restructure degrees, that is news. So we did some news in my year, which was about how like the special consideration, they were like making changes to special consideration, and then B, it was still very difficult to get it. And that was some of like the best news that I wrote that year. And also in my year, sexual assaults on campus were a very big national issue. So, again, just like looking into college culture, or like what can you do to report that sort of thing on campus? That's news. And also never forget, you can always talk to academics, and like the NTEU will be very active this year, and they love talking to students because students are the other side of the coin to academics. They just work for students. So if you talk to them, they'll definitely have things that are happening. And then just very quickly, is it a different news sense? Yes, it is, only because you need to ask what makes it relevant. So unfortunately, a lot of the student news that you will do, no one would really want to read it outside of a student context. Hopefully that is sort of like, hopefully you should be able to tell like what is and what isn't. And you can do that again by reading. So you can be like, oh, that story in the SMH was deemed to be at least a Sydney story, if not a national story, but like this other one wasn't. Yeah.
I also think like with like that kind of new sense, there are definitely parts where it will also majorly overlap. Like I remember there were times in our year of editing ONI where there were stories which were reported by people on our team or by our reporters that then got picked up by like mainstream and national media. I think one of the biggest things that happened in our year was when traditionally like ONI and then Waroni from ANU, Farrago at Uni Melb, and a bunch of other unis, they normally send student reporters to Canberra to actually sit in the budget lockup, which is where members of the press report on the announcement of the budget. And they actually kicked out and they revoked all of the student media, like essentially, like they revoked the right for any student media to be in that lockup in person. And that became like a national story, because then that led to things being uncovered. Like, what are they going to do? Like, are they cutting student things? Like, are they cutting education? Blah, blah, blah. And that became like quite a stir, I remember, in the media. So I definitely think that there are times when student news, as Naaman, you said so eloquently as well, will absolutely overlap with national news. A really cute question from Wing. This one says, what's the best story you think you wrote for ONI?
I think the best story I wrote is actually a feature which I did, which was about it was about the student lawyer at our, like we basically heard this like rumor or just like people, because there's the in-house lawyer at the SRC, and people were just like, oh, like did you know that like one time he went to the High Court? And then I was like, oh really, that's crazy. And then they're like, yeah, he's always talking about it. So basically I just interviewed him and I just wrote a feature. So basically, yeah, he is a lawyer who works for a student union. I think in his previous job he had just done pro bono work for like a community legal center, and there he'd picked up the case of an asylum seeker. It's actually extremely boring legally. It's just like the asylum seeker had not been afforded like a procedural fairness in this aspect of his claim, but it did go all the way to the High Court where he won. And I was like, this is an amazing story. It's like, this like small time, uni lawyer. And I wrote that up, and genuinely, yeah, it's one of the best things I've ever written. And it's like, that goes back to the point of, I just had so much like fun writing it and so much freedom in writing it. And you should always, student media actually there's really good opportunities for doing like people will often say yes to you. You might not think that they will, but people will often say yes. So I remember like before I edited, I remember reading a profile of Marine Faruqi in one of the previous year's editions. I think back then she was a state New South Wales senator. She'd just become the first Muslim, or the first female Muslim state senator, and they did a profile of her. And then it was just sort of like, oh, one to watch, here you go. And I was like, this is interesting. And then, like, sure enough, 2 or 3 years later, she became a federal senator. So basically, like, it's great. And you should ask people to sit down for profiles and, write features about niche things, because that's the only chance you'll get to do it.
Yeah. I'll also answer this question. I think it's really hard because, like, I would say that the best story I actually wrote for Oni, it's not like the best in terms of quality, but it's almost like a story where I've learned a lot. And it was actually probably like, I think quite early on into my year, this was like one of the first pieces of culture writing I had like ever done. It was like a review of Green Light by Lord. And I literally wrote it to like fill space in the paper. But I think like looking back, because like I was always interested in culture writing, but I didn't really know how to do it. So I just went ahead and was like, I want to write this review. And there were like so many mistakes. But I think looking back, that was almost the thing that like kickstarted my like real interest in like reviewing and like criticism. And it really taught me that like in order to write criticism, or to write, I guess, in any genre, you really have to be reading widely in that genre, which is not something that I had ever taken to heart before. God knows why. But like, I think this is one of the learning experiences you'll have as a student editor as well, is that you will be constantly just like reading and reading and reading, because you want to be reading things like aspirationally, to see like where you want your writing and where you want your publication go. You'll be reading, unfortunately, a lot of pieces that aren't particularly great. You'll be reading like a lot of submissions and writing that do have a lot of mistakes. And I think that the two forms of reading are almost like equally important, because then you get examples of like maybe common mistakes that you were making in your own writing that you only are able to pick up through reading someone else's writing. So definitely take that reading to heart. By the way, Indio says high court cases are so interesting. Do you name it?
Well, I guess they are. I was a terrible law student, so maybe that's why I found it very boring. It actually is, the case is like taught in admin law, because it did set some vague precedents. So I found that out later because I didn't pay attention in my class. I was going to say something very quickly, Michael, which is I realized I didn't tell my example, because I feel like I've really kept banging on the door of like, sharpen your idea of what is interesting and like sharpen your pitches. So I just wanted to very quickly give an example and actually answer the second half of that question, which I forgot to answer, which was how do you turn the student use sense into like a broad use sense? So this is an example. You don't have to take it to heart, because we may have been wrong. But in our year, we, for example, decided that we would really only do international news and like international politics writing if it had a very strong student or Australian angle. So we basically said, no news that is international news unless it has the University of Sydney or a student angle to it. And I remember one person pitched, and like there's objectively nothing wrong with this pitch, but he pitched about Brexit. And I think he did have a like student angle where he was basically saying, many University of Sydney students may be like dual citizens, like UK dual citizens, or like want to, maybe I'm making this up, but maybe want to study in the UK afterwards. How will like Brexit affect them? And we basically said like, thanks, but we're very sorry, but no, that's not the sort of stuff that we want to write. And definitely, again, you don't need to follow that, because maybe we were wrong. And now that I say it, it's perfectly fine pitch. But we at least had very clear rules of like, this is what is the bar and this is what isn't. And that teaches you, because you can't preempt another organization's news requirements. But for example, I did a story ages ago, which was during the American presidential primaries, about like Australians who were volunteering in that, like either for either for Bernie or for Warren, or I think some Biden people as well. So again, like, so an Australian publication, if you just pitch them, I want to write about the volunteers for Bernie, they probably will say no. It's like, there's no reason for you to write it. There's no reason that an Australian like would want to read that coming out of the SMH or the Guardian Australia, rather than like, the New York Times, like 538. But then you go, oh, well, but the thing is, like this person who's Australian is like fairly high up. Then it makes it more interesting. So that's like a mini example of how applying that same yardstick in student media sort of taught me how to do it in real world media. Yeah.
I want to move on to another question, just conscious that we have 10 or actually 9 minutes left.
Burn through the questions now.
This is actually a really interesting question, I find. So this is from Tend to Play, who says, I burnt out massively with student organizations on my first go at uni. Can students, real world reporters and creatives properly defend our time and health boundaries? Or is our industry and activity unsustainable?
Oh, that's a great question.
I know.
Yes, I think that there's a problem, not a problem, but the problem with student media, in that now that everything's online, there's absolutely no there's no ceiling to how much work you can do, and certainly depending on your organization, you will not be paid much money at all. So please, you should not burn out and like go too hard, and like you can decide to like defer or go part-time in your studies, but you shouldn't you shouldn't neglect other things that you've signed up to just because you're doing student media. Like, as for the other like real world reporters and creators, I mean, yeah, that's more, I think, the problem is like capitalism. The problem is just that it's very difficult when you have an industry with like less and less funding. You're paid less and less to do the work, but it still takes the amount of time. It is very hard. I'm sorry, I don't really have a very good answer to that, but like, it's definitely a real issue.
Yeah. I think that the actual industry, to get the like bad news out of the way first, I think the media industry is quite uniquely stressful, just because of like financial pressures, like so, as we've seen, unfortunately, so many media publications have shuttered over the past year just because the financial model that many media publications were operating under was not a sustainable model at all. And that then leads to like poor mental health among staff, just because of like the like extreme demands, I guess, of the industry. I don't necessarily have an answer for this, but I guess in terms of student media, we can talk about a couple of different practices that that we both implemented amongst our teams to facilitate like self-care and community care. And also, just plugging again, at 3:30, I think it is, there will actually be a workshop about this, which is about community and self-care in this conference. So definitely join that one as well. I'm sure Fiona and Susie are going to have much better and much more considered advice. But both Naaman and me, our teams did something called Safe Space. I don't know if Naaman, you want to talk to it more, because you guys were the ones who actually came up with it.
Oh, no, we copied it off people 2 years before us. So yeah, the idea was, because I think working in a team was also very difficult. So we basically wanted to have a space that in the beginning of a meeting where we would say, if there had been any like either personal, other like, outside of our, work and student media issues that were affecting us, we wanted to like raise issues with like people's workloads, that we would set aside time to do that. I think it had mixed effectiveness, because I think, a lot of people don't really want, like, it takes a lot sometimes to actually bring it up. So it's obviously not a foolproof thing, but, we did make, it's a good idea to have that as an opportunity at the beginning of a meeting, for example, to talk about it.
Yeah. For us, it was kind of similar in that the structure was definitely there, where there was like 10 minutes set at the beginning of every meeting to through any grievances or any like poor mental health or any like things that we wanted to share or were feeling. There were definitely times where not everyone felt comfortable sharing, and that's also totally okay. But I think having that opportunity there, or having some kind of like very formalized structure in place, like I think generally is good to to allow people to have that opportunity if they want, and to make sure that these kind of things aren't just happening on like an ad hoc basis. So it's not always the person who feels the most comfortable sharing. It's like everyone is encouraged to share. And I also think things like frequent mental health check-ins is really good as well, because student media is, I would say that student media is perhaps even more uniquely stressful than real world media, purely because, Naaman, as you said, you aren't getting paid like an actual salary in 99% of cases. And it does feel like you have to juggle essentially sometimes full-time hours with like a full uni load and like actual work that will help you pay the rent, et cetera, et cetera. So definitely having these formalized practices in place and letting people like speak up when they don't have the capacity to do something.
Yeah. I just have a good question that I wanted to highlight, which is also from India, which is from your industry experience, do you recommend finding your own niche of stories and topics to cover, or keeping it as general as possible? I don't have an answer to that exact dichotomy, but I think you got to try and make your writing super original. So again, this is like sort of talking to the point of like why we said no international news. So definitely, you know, all bylines are good and it's always good to get published, but especially in news, and I think also again in like culture, like many people love to write about culture. You need to figure out what makes this piece interesting, and if it literally has been said by like a large publication, you shouldn't re-say it. And then news is good, but then like in terms of say an employer wanting to hire you, they will respect original quality news, even if it is niche, because they might not republish it. But then you go, this is an example of my ability to dig up news, and I can do that for you in this other way. So definitely try and get original news. Hopefully what we talked about gave you an idea of what original news is, but definitely like have to think about it yourself, because there's no one answer. But yeah.
In terms of finding a niche as well, I actually think it's like, obviously there are pros and cons to both, but I think over the course of my student media year, I definitely found a niche, I guess, which was like culture writing in general, but then also like some specific forms of culture writing and like forms of culture that I was particularly interested in covering. I don't necessarily think you should go into your year of student media with the aim of like, you must come out of it with a particular beat that is going to be the focus for the rest of your career. I think it's more about going into it quite open-minded, trying different things out, and then I guess it's almost like process of elimination. Like, what things did you absolutely hate covering? What things do you not want to write about? And I guess like it will bring you closer to that form of discovery, like what actually excites you and interests you about the media and about writing.
Yeah.
No, you go, Naaman.
No, I was going to say we have a minute left.
I know. Okay, maybe we should do one final very quick question. This one is from Sophie, who says, what is the best way to gauge your audience's interests? So Sophie's been using Google feedback forms and people's choice voting for favored pieces. Do you have any other suggestions? I think so for us, it was very digital. It was like, because we had an online magazine and like Facebook, social media, etc. You could easily see like what articles were getting more views.
Feedback forms is amazing. We definitely did do that. It's a good idea. But if you have online page views, but also like don't be too beholden to what your audience finds interesting. I think stuff that is interesting you already know, and people will also know. Like, you shouldn't necessarily just chase the views. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I think that actually brings us to the end of our session. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in, and also thank you for such good questions. Like seriously, I think like so many questions here got the cogs in my mind turning. I'm sure same with Naaman.
Yeah, same. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And thank you for hosting, Michael. You're a great host and moderator.
Thank you. I'll be back if you're joining for the design workshop at 1:30. Otherwise, good luck for your student media years. Me and Naaman are, of course, on Twitter, etc. if you ever want to reach us.
Yeah.
And enjoy lunch.